Edited and published by Ligohi Software. Rights have been reserved to this audio-visual recording. To find more books and information about other educational resources, please visit ligohi.com. Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who lacked but one thing on earth to make them entirely happy. The king was young, handsome, and wealthy. The queen had a nature as good and gentle as her face was beautiful. And they adored one another, having married for love, which among kings and queens is not always the rule. Moreover, they reigned over a kingdom at peace, and their people were devoted to them. What more, then, could they possibly want? Well, they wanted one thing very badly, and the lack of it grieved them more than words can tell. They had no child. The poor queen especially was in despair. At last, however, to her own and her husband's inexpressible joy, she gave birth to a daughter. As soon as the palace guns announced this event, the whole nation went wild with delight. Flags waved everywhere, bells were set pealing until the steeples rocked. Crowds tossed up their hats and cheered, while the soldiers presented arms, and even strangers meeting in the street fell upon each other's neck, exclaiming, "Our queen has a daughter! Yes, yes, our queen has a daughter! Long live the little princess!" A name had now to be found for the royal babe. And the king and queen, after talking over some scores of names, at length decided to call her Aurora, which means the dawn. The dawn itself thought they was never more beautiful than this darling of theirs. The next business, of course, was to hold a christening. They agreed that it must be a magnificent one. And as a first step they invited all the fairies they could find in the land to be godmothers to the Princess Aurora, that each one of them might bring her a gift, as was the custom with fairies in those days, and so she might have all the perfections imaginable. After making long inquiries, for I should tell you that all this happened not so many 100 years ago, when fairies were already growing somewhat scarce, they found 7. But this again pleased them, because 7 is a lucky number. After the ceremonies of the christening, while the trumpeters sounded their fanfares and the guns boomed out again from the great tower, all the company returned to the royal palace to find a great feast arrayed. Seats of honor had been set for the 7 fairy godmothers, and before each was laid a dish of honor, with a dish cover of solid gold, and beside the dish a spoon, a knife, and a fork, all of pure gold and all set with diamonds and rubies. But just as they were seating themselves, to the dismay of everyone, there appeared in the doorway a woman, dressed in black. Her chin and her hooked nose almost met together, like a pair of nutcrackers, for she had very few teeth. But between them she growled to the guests in a terrible voice, "I am the fairy Violetta. Pray, where are your king's manners, that I have not been invited?" She had in fact been overlooked. And this was not surprising, because she lived at the far end of the country, in a lonely tower set round by the forest. For 50 years she had never come out of this tower, and everyone believed her to be dead or enchanted. That, you must know, is the most common way the fairies have of ending. They lock themselves up in a tower or within a hollow oak, and are never seen again. The king, though she chose to accuse his manners, was in fact the nicest of men. He hurried to express his regrets, led her to a table with his own hand, and ordered a dish to be set for her. But with the best will in the world he could not give her a dish cover such as the others had, because 7 only had been made for the 7 invited fairies. The fairy Violetta received his excuses very ingraciously, while accepting a seat. It was plain that she had taken deep offense. One of the other fairies, Heidi by name, who sat by, overheard her mumbling threats between her teeth. And fearing she might bestow some unlucky gift upon the little princess, went as soon as she rose from the table and hid herself close by the cradle, behind the tapestry, that she might have the last word and undo, so far as she could, what evil the fairy Violetta might have in her mind. She had scarcely concealed herself before the other fairies began to advance, one by one, to bestow their gifts on the princess. The youngest promised her that she should be the most beautiful creature in the world. The The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third, a marvelous elegance in all her ways. The fourth, that she should dance to perfection. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. The sixth, that she should play exquisitely on all instruments of music. Now came the turn of the fairy Violetta. Her head nodded with spite, as she bent over the cradle above the head of the pretty babe, who slept on sweetly, too young and too innocent as yet to dream of any such thing as mischief in this world. "This is my gift to you, Princess Aurora," announced the evil fairy, still in her creaking voice that shook as spitefully as her body. "I promise that one day you shall pierce your hand with a spindle, and on that day you shall die." At these terrible words the poor queen fell back fainting into her husband's arms. A trembling seized the whole court. The ladies were in tears, and the younger lords and knights were calling out to seize and burn the wicked witch, when the good fairy Heidi stepped forth from behind the tapestry, and passing by Violetta, who stood scornful in the midst of this outcry, she thus addressed their majesties. "Take comfort, O king and queen, your daughter shall not die thus. It is true, I have not the power wholly to undo what this sister of mine has done. The princess must indeed pierce her hand with a spindle. But, instead of dying, she shall only fall into a deep slumber that shall last for many, many years, at the end of which a king's son shall come and awake her. Whenever this misfortune happens to your little Aurora, do not doubt that I, the fairy Heidi, her godmother, shall get news of it and come at once to render what help I may." The king, while declaring himself infinitely obliged to the good fairy Heidi, could not help feeling that hers was but cold comfort at the best. He gave orders to close the christening festivities at once, although the fairy Violetta had already taken her departure, passing unharmed through the crowd of folk, every one of whom wished her ill, and riding away, it was generally agreed upon, a broomstick. To satisfy the king's faithful subjects, however, who were unaware of any misadventure, the palace fireworks were duly let off with a grand set piece wishing long life to the Princess Aurora in all the colors of the rainbow. But His Majesty, after bowing from the balcony amid the banging of rockets and hissing of Catherine wheels, retired to a private room with his chamberlain, and there, still amid the noise of explosions and cheering, drew up the first harsh proclamation of his reign. It forbade all, on pain of death, to use a spindle in spinning or even to have a spindle in his house. Heralds took copies of this proclamation and marched through the land reading it, to the sound of trumpets, from every marketplace. And it gravely puzzled and distressed all who listened, for they prided themselves on their linen. Its fine quality was a byword throughout the neighboring kingdoms, and they knew themselves to be famous for it. But what sort of linen, said they, would His Majesty have us spin without spindles? They had a great affection, however, as we have seen, for their monarch. And for 15 or 16 years all the spinning wheels were silent throughout the land. The little Princess Aurora grew up without ever having seen one. But one day, the king and queen being absent at one of their country houses, she gave her governess the slip, and running at will through the palace and upstairs from one chamber to another, she came at length to a turret with a winding staircase, from the top of which a strange whirring sound attracted her and seemed to invite her to climb. As she mounted after the sound, on a sudden it ceased. But still she followed the stairs and came, at the very top, to an open door through which she looked in upon a small garret where sat an honest old woman alone, winding her distaff. The good soul had never, in 16 years, heard of the king's prohibition against spindles. And this is just the sort of thing that happens in palaces. "What are you doing, goody?" asked the princess. "I am spinning, pretty one," answered the old woman, who did not know who she was. "Spinning? What is that? I wonder sometimes," said the old woman, "what the world is coming to, in these days." And that, of course, was natural enough, and might occur to anybody after living so long as she had lived in a garret on the top of a tower. "Spinning," she said wisely, "is spinning, or was. And, gentle or simple, no one is fit to keep house until she has learned to spin. But how pretty it is! said the princess. "How do you do it? Give it to me and let me see if I can do so well." She had no sooner grasped the spindle, she was overeager perhaps, or just a little bit clumsy, or maybe the fairy decree had so ordained it, than it pierced her hand and she dropped down in a swoon. The old lady in a flurry ran to the head of the stairs and called for help. There was no bell rope, and, her voice being weak and her turret in the remotest corner of the palace, it was long before anyone heard her in the servants' hall. The servants, too, in the absence of the king and queen, were playing cards, and could not be interrupted by anybody until their game was finished. Then they sat down and discussed whose business it was to attend on a call from that particular turret. And this again proved to be a nice point, since nobody could remember having been summoned thither, and all were against setting up a precedent, as they called it. In the end they decided to send up the lowest of the junior page boys. But he had a weakness which he somehow forgot to mention, that of fainting at the sight of blood. So when he reached the garret and fainted, the old woman had to begin screaming over again. This time they sent up a scullery maid, who, being good-natured and unused to the ways of the palace, made the best haste she could to the garret, whence presently she returned with the terrible news. The servants, who had gone back to their game, now dropped their cards and came running. All the household, in fact, came pouring up the turret stairs. The palace physicians themselves crowding in such numbers that the poor Princess Aurora would have been hard put to it for fresh air, could fresh air have restored her. They dashed water on her face, slapped her hands, and rubbed her temples with Hungary water. But nothing would bring her to. Meanwhile, a messenger had ridden off post-haste with the tidings, and while the doctors were still consulting and shaking their heads, the king himself came galloping home to the palace. In the midst of his grief he bethought him of what the fairies had foretold, and being persuaded that, since they had said it, this was fated to happen, he blamed no one but gave orders to carry the princess to the finest apartment in the palace, and there lay her on a bed embroidered with gold and silver. Her slumber had not taken away the warm tints of her complexion. Her cheeks were like carnations, her lips like coral. And though her eyes were closed and the long lashes would not lift, her soft breathing told that she was not dead. The king commanded them all to leave her and let her sleep in peace until the hour of her awakening should arrive. Now when the accident befell our princess, the good fairy Heidi, who had saved her life, happened to be in the kingdom of Mataquin, 12,000 leagues away. But news of it was brought to her in an incredibly short space of time by a little dwarf who owned a pair of 7-league boots. These were boots in which you could walk 7 leagues at a single stride. She set off at once to the help of her beloved goddaughter, and behold, in an hour this good fairy arrived at the palace, in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. Our king met her and handed her down from the chariot. She approved of all that he had done. But, greatly foreseeing as she was, she bethought her that, as all mortals perish within 100 years or so, when the time came for the princess to awake she would be distressed at finding herself orphaned and alone in this old castle. So this is what she did. She touched with her wand everything and everybody in the palace. The king, the queen, the ministers and privy councillors. The archbishop, who was the grand almoner, the bishops and the minor clergy. The maids of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, governesses, gentlemen in waiting, heralds, physicians, officers, masters of the household, cooks, scullions, lackeys, guards, Switzers, pages, and footmen. She touched the princess's tutors and the court professors in the midst of their deep studies. She touched likewise all the horses in the stables, with the grooms, the huge mastiffs in the yard, even Tiny the princess's little pet dog, and Fluff her black and white cat, that lay coiled on a cushion by her bedside. The instant the fairy Heidi touched them they all fell asleep, not to awake until the same moment as their mistress, that all might be ready to wait on her when she needed them. The very spits at the fire went to sleep, loaded as they were with partridges and pheasants. And the fire went to sleep too. All this was done in a moment. The fairies were never long about their business in those days. Within a few hours there grew up, all around the park, such a number of trees of all sizes, and such a tangle of briars and undergrowth, that neither beast nor man could find a passage. They grew until nothing but the tops of the castle towers could be seen, and these only from a good way off. There was no mistake about it. The fairy had done her work well, and the princess might sleep with no fear of visits from the inquisitive. One day, many years afterwards, an incomparable young prince happened to ride a hunting on that side of the country which lay next to the tangled forest, and asked, what were those towers he saw pushing up above the midst of a great thick wood? They all answered him as they heard tell. Some said it was an old castle haunted by ghosts. The most general opinion was that an ogre dwelt there, and that he carried off thither all the children he could catch, to eat them at his ease. No one could follow him, for he alone knew how to find a passage through the briars and brambles. The prince could not tell which to believe of all these informants, for all gave their versions with equal confidence. He was turning from one to another in perplexity, when a peasant spoke up and said, Your Highness, long ago I heard my father tell that there was in yonder castle a princess, the most beautiful that ever man saw. That she must lie asleep there for many years, and that one day she will be awakened by a king's son, for whom she was destined. At these words the prince felt himself afire. He believed, without weighing it, that he could accomplish this fine adventure. And, spurred on by love and ambition, he resolved to explore then and there and discover the truth for himself. Leaping down from his horse he started to run towards the wood, and had almost reached the edge of it before the attendant courtiers guessed his design. They called to him to come back, but he ran on, and was about to fling himself boldly into the undergrowth, when as by magic all the great trees, the shrubs, the creepers, briars and brambles, unlaced themselves of their own accord and drew aside to let him pass. He found himself within a long glade or avenue, at the end of which glimmered the walls of an old castle. And towards this he strode. It surprised him somewhat that none of his attendants were following him. The reason being that as soon as he had passed through it, the undergrowth drew close as ever again. He heard their voices, fainter and fainter behind him, beyond the barrier, calling him to desist. But he held on his way without one backward look. He was a prince, and young, and therefore valiant. He came to the castle, and pushing aside the vines that hung like a curtain over the gateway, entered a wide outer court and stood still for a moment, holding his breath, while his eyes traveled over a scene that might well have frozen them with terror. The court was silent, dreadfully silent, yet it was by no means empty. On all hands lay straight, stiff bodies of men and beasts, seemingly all dead. Nevertheless, as he continued to gaze, his courage returned. For the pimpled noses and ruddy faces of the Switzers told him that they were no worse than asleep. He stepped by them and passed across a second great court paved with marble. He mounted a broad flight of marble steps leading to the main doorway. He entered a guard room, just within the doorway, where the guards stood in rank with shouldered muskets, every man of them asleep and snoring his best. He made his way through a number of rooms filled with ladies and gentlemen, some standing, others sitting, but all asleep. He drew aside a heavy purple curtain, and once more held his breath. For he was looking into the great hall of state where, at a long table, sat and slumbered the king with his council. The Lord Chancellor slept in the act of dipping pen into ink pot, the Archbishop in the act of eating food, and between the spectacles on the Archbishop's nose and the spectacles on the Lord Chancellor's, a spider had spun a beautiful web. The prince tiptoed very carefully past these august sleepers and, leaving the hall by another door, came to the foot of the grand staircase. Up this, too, he went, wandered along a corridor to his right, and, stopping by hazard at one of the many doors, opened it and looked into a bathroom lined with mirrors. 3 steps led down to the bath, and at the head of them stood a couch, with towels, and court suit laid ready, exquisitely embroidered and complete to the daintiest of lace ruffles and the most delicate of body linen. Then the prince bethought him that he had ridden far before ever coming to the wood, and the mirrors told him that he was also somewhat travel-stained from his passage through it. So, having by this time learned to accept any new wonder without question, he undressed himself and took a bath, which he thoroughly enjoyed. Nor was he altogether astonished, when he tried on the clothes, to find that they fitted him perfectly. Even the resetted shoes of satin might have been made to his measure. Having arrayed himself thus heartily, he resumed his quest along the corridor. The very next door he tried opened on a chamber decorated with white and gold. And there, on a bed the curtains of which were drawn wide, he saw the most lovely vision he had ever seen. A princess of a beauty so brilliant that he could not have believed this world held the like. But she lay still, so still. The prince drew near, trembling and wondering, and sank on his knees beside her. Still she lay, scarcely seeming to breathe, and he bent and touched with his lips the little hand that rested, light as a rose leaf, on the coverlet. With that, as the long spell of her enchantment came to an end, the princess woke up, and looking at him with eyes filled with gratitude and tenderness. "Is it you, my prince?" she said. The prince, charmed by these words, and still more by the manner in which they were spoken, knew not how to find words for the bliss in his heart. He assured her that he loved her better than his own self. The prince helped the princess to rise. She was completely dressed, and very magnificently too. Taking his beloved Princess Aurora by the hand, he led her to her parents, who embraced her, and their first transports over, turned to welcome him as a son, being charmed quite apart from their gratitude, by the modest gallantry of his address. They passed into a great dining room lined with mirrors, where they were served food by the royal attendants. After supper, without loss of time, the archbishop married the prince and Princess Aurora in the chapel of the castle. The prince led his bride back to the city, where they were acclaimed by the populace and lived happy ever after. Edited and published by Ligohi Software. Rights have been reserved to this audio-visual recording. To find more books and information about other educational resources, please visit ligohi.com.